All right, my friends, it's the chapter we've all been waiting for. The knights in single combat. So I'm sure you don't need reminding, but when we left off, Igraine and the Sorrowful Knight were getting ready to do their, for Igraine to be the squire, and for the Sorrowful Knight, of course, to fight Rowan Heartless. So here we go. When Igraine and the Sorrowful Knight climbed out of the stone lion's mouth, they could already hear the fanfares in Osmond's camp announcing single combat. The Sorrowful Knight whistled softly, and his gray mare emerged from among the trees as if she had been waiting for him there. She was not alone. Lancelot was with her. He had burrs in his mane and dirt in his coat, but he looked very happy and nuzzled Igraine in greeting. She lovingly stroked his muzzle and swung herself up on his back. "Things are going to get exciting," she whispered to him. "I just hope no one recognizes you." The torches around the tilting ground were lit, although dusk was only just falling, and Osmond's soldiers formed a double rank, lining their path as they entered the camp. Osmond was already enthroned in his armchair on a dais put up especially for him, surrounded by servants and some of his knights, and Rowan Heartless was waiting in the middle of the space that had been marked out for the combat. His horse was harnessed and decorated as if for a great tournament, and he himself wore a huge blood-red plume on his helmet. "So, I see you come creeping through the back door again," he called as the Sorrowful Knight and Igraine rode towards him. "Did you expect us to let down the drawbridge so that Osmond the Greedy could take Pimpernel without a fight?" replied the Sorrowful Knight, reining in his horse just in front of Osmond's platform. "Remember you gave your word, Osmond," he called up. "Every one of your soldiers is my witness. If your knight is defeated, you will lift the siege. He who breaks his word loses his honor." Osmond folded his arms. "My knight will not be defeated," he replied, "and let's not have no more talk." Let me try that again. "And let's have no more talk. Let's see you fight." Without another word, the Sorrowful Knight rode to his place. There was no coat of arms or banner displayed there, only a lance sticking in the ground. Igraine reached into her belt and took out a small bundle. "I know you took your coat of arms off your armor because of your lost honor," she said quietly. "So I've brought my great-grandfather's banner. It used to fly outside his tent at every tournament. May I tie it to that lance?" The Sorrowful Knight smiled. "Do what you feel you must, squire," he said quietly. So Igraine unfurled the banner of Peleus of Pimpernel. It had gotten rather stained over the years, and Albert had to cast a spell to mend several moth-eaten holes, but it was still very handsome. The coat of arms showed a beaver sitting on a golden book with a snake coiled around the tree trunk next to it. Igraine tied the banner to the lance in the ground with a golden cord and then rode her horse to stand beside the Sorrowful Knight's mare. "Here we go," murmured the knight, and he closed his visor and sat up very straight in the saddle. "Who's your squire?" Rowan Heartless called to them. "Not that little minx, is it?" "I'll overlook the fact that she's on a horse, which is no place for a squire, and although she's wearing armor, that doesn't bother me. But since when have girls been allowed to act as squires? I thought you set such store by the rules of chivalry. Ever sorrowful and sighing knight." The Sorrowful Knight opened his visor with a furious jerk. "You know the rules that matter to me very well," he called across the lists. "The rules of honor are these: protect the weak, never covet what belongs to someone else, use your strength and skill in arms only in honorable competition, never break the word you have given, and do not strive for power's sake. Those are the rules of chivalry by which a knight lives. And anyone who lives by them, whether a man or a girl, should be accorded the honor due to him or her. The girl at my side certainly deserves to be honored more than you or your predatory master." Rowan Heartless's pale face twisted in mockery. "I am no squire whom you must instruct in the rules of chivalry," he replied. "If that little minx wants to play your squire, very well." He closed his visor. "There's only one thing I want to do now, and that's to fight." Without another word, he dug the spurs into his horse, rode to his squires, and took the lance from the first squire's hand. Igraine felt her hatred for the hedgehog like a stone in her stomach. With shaking hands, she too gave the Sorrowful Knight his first lance. "You give me your word, brave Igraine," he whispered. "Stay exactly where you are. Never mind what happens." "Yes, all right," whispered Igraine, and looked around. Osmond's soldiers were crowding around the tilting ground, and beyond them, behind the battlements, over the castle gate, she saw Albert and Bertram. The two of them looked tiny and very, very far away, And suddenly, for a split second, Igraine was afraid she would never get back to Pimpernel. The castle looked so small and dilapidated behind all those soldiers. The stone lions were hanging their heads on their ledge. The gargoyles' eyes were closed and they were snoring. Igraine thought she could hear them herself, even with her helmet on. But Osmond didn't seem to notice any of that. He had eyes only for the tilting ground, as the sorrowful knight had planned. So if you remember, they're trying to distract Osmond. So there's our spiky knight friend on his horse with his lance. You can see the castle. You can see the sorrowful knight. And Igraine over here to the side, which they're pretty tiny. At a signal from Osmond, 4 servants raised their trumpets and blew a fanfare announcing the first joust. Heartless and the sorrowful knight put their lances under their arms, settled in the saddle one last time, and rode their snorting horses into the fray. The 2 men galloped toward each other over the dusty ground. Their armor clinked. The horses snorted under the weight of the armed riders. The plume on the spiky knight's helmet shone red as fire. When the points of their lances were only the length of a horse's stride apart, Igraine held her breath, and Osmond leaned forward in his chair. Rowan Heartless's lance struck the sorrowful knight's armor with a fearful crash, but the sorrowful knight had hit his opponent too, right between the spikes of his suit of armor. Both riders swayed in the saddle, but neither of them fell. Furiously, Heartless flung his splintered lance down in the dust before riding back to his place. One of his squires scurried forward to take it away. The sorrowful knight, however, carried his own split lance back to Igraine himself. She was horrified to hear how heavily he was breathing. "Are you wounded?" she asked, worried. But the knight shook his head. "No," he managed to say, "and that will surprise Heartless, since he always unhorsed me at the first tilt before." Rowan Heartless, back at his own end of the tilting ground, was shouting at his squires, kicking out at them with his armored foot, and rejecting all the lances they offered to him. "He's looking for the lance with the green glow," Igraine whispered to the sorrowful knight. He was sitting perfectly still on his horse beside her, with his visor open as he watched his opponent ranting and raging. Igraine gave him the second lance. Osmond was looking nervously at his champion. Finally, Rowan Heartless snatched the lance from the hands of one of the squires, gave it a suspicious look, and stuck it under his arm. Angrily, he slammed down his visor and rode his horse back onto the tilting ground. The sun was slowly slinking behind the woods. Darkness was falling, but the light of the torches illuminated the empty space marked out between the tents and the castle. Up on the castle wall, Albert summoned glowworms to light up the battlements. Green light spilled from the tower window. Once again, Osmond's servants blew their trumpets, and for the second time the 2 knights urged their horses forward. Soon they lowered their long lances. Each iron tip swung up and down, pointing at the breast of the oncoming knight. Once again, Rowan Heartless just managed to get his blow in first, but his aim was not good. His lance glanced off the sorrowful knight's armed shoulder. Meanwhile, the sorrowful knight struck Heartless in the middle of his chest with his blunted lance. The terrible blow made the spiky knight sway so much that only gripping his horse's mane kept him in the saddle. So if you remember up until this point, the spiky knight is undefeated. So every jousting match that he has entered, he has won. So at this point, he's feeling a little unsure. And if you notice, the next sentence says, "A murmur rang through the throng of soldiers crowding around the tilting ground." So even the soldiers that are watching are really surprised at what's happening, although we as the readers know what's going on. They were even sitting on the catapults that had been cleared away, on the wreck of the battering ram, anywhere they could get a good view of the fight. Osmond the Greedy, up on his dais, folded his arms and angrily chewed his beard. His weakened castellan straightened himself with difficulty, rode back to his squires, swaying, and beat them about the ears with his splintered lance. Igraine couldn't make out what he was shouting, but she saw 2 of the squires run to their master's tent. "He still thinks they've given him the wrong lance," she whispered when the sorrowful knight was back beside her. When he opened his visor, she handed him a scarf so that he could wipe the sweat from his face. "You are wonderful," she said. "I've never seen such a good lance thrust before." "Don't exaggerate," said the knight, but he couldn't help smiling once again. He's furious, he added quietly. So furious that he's making mistakes. That's good from our point of view. Very good. The light in the tower is getting brighter and brighter, Igraine whispered back. The magic can't be much longer now, so don't take too many risks. What's more, we have only 3 lances left, and one of them is a bit wobbly. At that moment, Heartless's squires came back with 2 lances. The spiky knight examined them both and then flung them angrily to the ground. Igraine laughed softly. Look at that. Any moment now he's going to realize that he doesn't have an enchanted lance anymore. What do you think? But the sorrowful knight didn't answer. He looked down at his horse in concern, made the mare take a few steps forward and back again, then he patted her flank, which was wet with sweat, and bent down to Igraine. Listen, he said in a low voice, I'm going to have to ask Heartless to continue the combat with swords on foot. My mare is lame, and I must spare her. If Heartless will not agree to my request, he'll probably unhorse me with his lance at the next tilt, because I won't be able to ride to meet him fast enough. But have no fear. Heaven knows it wouldn't be the first time I land in the dust. I'll go on fighting on foot, and if Heartless acts honorably, he will dismount from his own horse and finish what we've begun with a sword. If he doesn't, I'll have to try pulling him out of the saddle by his lance. Igraine looked at him in alarm, but there was no time for her to protest. Rowan Heartless was already waiting, his horse restlessly pawing the dust. When the sorrowful knight rode out, too, everyone could see that his horse was lame. The gray mare was limping on her right foreleg. The sorrowful knight signaled to his opponent to meet him in the front of Osmond's dais. Terrified, Igraine watched them talking. When the sorrowful knight returned to his place, he glanced briefly at Igraine and shook his head. Her heart almost stopped. For the 3rd time, a fanfare blew for the next tilt. For the 3rd time, the knights lowered their lances. Sir Lamorak had taken Igraine to a tournament twice, although he hated all that fighting business, and she had been to see some other tournaments with Bertram. She had eagerly awaited every tilt with her heart beating fast, so excited that she couldn't sit still for a second. She had climbed up on the bench to get a better view and cheered when a knight fell in the dust. But everything was different in this fight. Igraine didn't want to watch. She just wanted to close her eyes. She wanted it to be over. This time, her heart was beating fast, but not with excitement. She suddenly knew only too well what fear felt like. Terrible, breathtaking fear. The snorting of the horses hurt her ears, and when the lances crashed as they struck the knight's armor, Igraine clenched her fists so tightly that her fingernails cut into her hands. The sorrowful knight took his lance under his arm once more, even more firmly than before, and raised his shield to ward off the lance thrust of his opponent, who was racing toward him. But just then, the gray mare's lame foreleg gave way beneath her. She shied and threw him out of the saddle. At the last moment, Rowan Heartless raised his lance and made his horse swerve to avoid a collision with the stumbling mare. But the sorrowful knight fell on the trampled earth with a clatter of armor. Staggering, he got to his feet again, and Igraine was alarmed to see him put a hand to his shoulder. The gray mare limped over to him and nuzzled him, but at a sign from him she hobbled back to Igraine with her head lowered. Rowan Heartless was still astride his horse with his unused lance in his hand. He was staring down at his fallen opponent without any visible emotion. Not a sound was to be heard from the watching soldiers. Osmond had risen to his feet. Is all lost now? Igraine wondered, glancing at the castle. Her parents still weren't standing on the battlements as she had hoped, but the tower was shining as if the stones themselves were glowing green. Suddenly, Heartless sat erect in the saddle, spurred on his horse, and rode toward his challenger. The sorrowful knight was steady on his feet again. He had drawn his sword, the blade that had once belonged to Igraine's great-grandfather. For a moment, Igraine thought Heartless was going to attack the sorrowful knight with his lance and ride him down into the dust. But before she could draw her sword and urge Lancelot into the lists, the spiky knight reined in his horse and threw the lance to the ground. A murmur ran through the ranks of the watching soldiers as he dismounted and drew his sword. In the torchlight, the blade looked as if it were made of fire. The 2 knights stalked stiffly toward each other. By now the sky above them was black as pitch, and only the slender moon stood in the sky above Pimpernel. The swords clashed with terrible force again and again. Igraine jumped nervously at each stroke. She closed her eyes, opened them again, clutched her own sword in both her hands, which felt far too weak to lift it, and waited for her heart to break with fear. The two knights were fighting ever more fiercely, but the swords were heavy, very heavy, and soon their strokes were less certain and missed their mark. One or other of the combatants was forced down on his armed knee more and more frequently, and they both found getting up increasingly difficult each time. Their gasping and groaning rang in Igraine's ears. There was not another sound to be heard in the night. And then suddenly Heartless raised his sword for a fearsome stroke. The sorrowful knight parried it, forced his opponent back, and drove him backward with a flurry of sword strokes, until Heartless lost his balance, stumbled, and fell. Gasping, he lay on his back, right in the middle of the tilting ground. His sword had fallen from his hand and was too far away for him to reach it, and the sorrowful knight put the point of his own sword to his opponent's breast. "We won!" shouted Igraine, so loudly that for a moment everyone turned to her. Osmond made use of that moment. He leaped up, went to the edge of his dais, and spread his fingers. Hardly anyone noticed, but Igraine recognized magic when she saw it. She knew at once why the spiky knight's sword was sliding back to him over the trampled ground. Without thinking of the promise she had made the sorrowful knight, without thinking of what she had promised her parents and Albert either, she swung herself up on Lancelot's back, galloped onto the tilting ground, and brought the horse to a standstill right above the enchanted blade. Snorting, he set one front hoof on the great sword. "Call your squire off," roared Osmond. "You're breaking the rules, sorrowful knight." "You're the one who's breaking them," Igraine shouted back. "Since when do swords start moving of their own accord without magic?" Osmond did not reply. A murmur rose among his soldiers. The sorrowful knight, however, took the point of his sword away from the spiky knight's breast and straightened up. "You are defeated, Rowan Heartless," he said. "Get up and go away with your greedy master. But first, tell me where you are hiding the noble ladies who are entrusted to my care." So if you remember, the reason the sorrowful knight is sorrowful is that he was kind of caring for three ladies who he was protecting, and they have vanished. And so he believes Rowan Heartless to be responsible for their disappearance. So I'm just reminding you of that part because it's been a while. Heartless rose to his feet with difficulty. His heavy armor, weighed down by all those iron spikes, made him stagger, and when he opened his visor, his face was white with rage. "You haven't defeated me," he shouted at the sorrowful knight. "No one defeats me. The little minx there has cast a spell on me. That's the only reason why you brought her. She's a magician like the rest of her family." "That's not true," cried Igraine indignantly. "You wicked liar! You were going to save yourself by magic, you and your greedy—" But she got no further. "Seize her!" cried Osmond. "Seize them both and put them in chains." Igraine looked around in alarm. Some of the soldiers were hesitating, but enough of them were ready to obey. They came storming onto the tilting ground from all sides with lances, spears, and drawn swords. Lancelot pranced on the spot and threw up his head. Igraine looked desperately up at the castle. The tower was dark. The whole place was dark. She couldn't even see Albert on the battlements. "Flee, Igraine!" cried the sorrowful knight, fending off the first soldiers trying to seize him. "Leave him to me," roared Heartless, snatching a sword from the hand of one of the men. "Let me pass. He's mine." "The knight can wait. Bring me the girl," Osmond called to them. "Bring her to me alive. Do you understand?" Heartless swung around, a furious retort on his lips, but Osmond stared at him until he bowed his head. Igraine saw him coming toward her. She struck out with her sword at every hand reaching for her, fended off spear points, kicked helmets and breastplates. Lancelot turned in a circle, neighing shrilly, kicked a bit, but however hard Igraine tried to get him close to the sorrowful knight, she simply couldn't do it. The stallion was far too agitated, and the milling throng around her was growing denser all the time. She had to watch helplessly as the sorrowful knight was thrown to the ground, and the next moment Heartless was standing in front of her. "Well, little minx," he cried, "how do you like the life of chivalry? Not quite the same as playing on the battlements in a shiny suit of armor, is it?" With a single blow, he struck Igraine's short sword from her hand, pulled her out of her saddle, and threw her over his shoulder like a sack of beans. She tried to bite him, his fingers, his nose, his ears, anywhere, but he was protected by his chainmail and his honor. Excuse me, he has no honor. His armor. Laughing, the spiky knight carried her to Osmond's dais and threw her at his master's feet. Igraine tried to scramble up, but two of Osmond's servants forced her back onto her knees. Excellent, cried Osmond, looking down at her with a mocking smile, and now your silly brother will bring us those books in person. He won't be able to let the drawbridge down fast enough, if that means getting his captured little sister back. And when your foolish parents are home from their journey, added Osmond, pulling at his beard with satisfaction, then they won't find a castle standing here anymore. As for their children, well, I have yet to decide what I'm going to turn you two into. Here's the other prisoner, sir. Igraine spun around. 3 soldiers were forcing the sorrowful knight down on his knees in front of Osmond's dais. They had torn the helmet off his head. Osmond, you have no honor, said the knight wearily. You have broken your word. Nothing could be more disgraceful. Oh, yes, it could. You brought an enchantress with you as your squire, replied Osmond scornfully. That's truly disgraceful. You're the knight without honor. I'm not an enchantress, you dirty liar, shouted Igraine, trying to bite Osmond on the knee, but he stepped back just in time. I think I'll turn you into a gnat, he said, or a yapping puppy, and your magician of a brother will make an excellent donkey. Raising his hand, he signaled to his soldiers. Take these 2 to Dark Rock and throw them into the Dungeon of Despair. Her brother will have to bring me the books in person if he wants his sister back. I'm sick and tired of sleeping in a stuffy tent outside this crumbling castle. But just as the soldiers were hauling the 2 prisoners to their feet, a bright flash of lightning shot across the sky. It came from Pimpernel, shot down from the castle battlements, ran zigzag over the tilting ground, and struck Osmond's armchair. Colored sparks flew through the air, and all of a sudden, instead of the chair, Albert stood there, life-size, on the wooden dais. Blue fire dripped from his magic coat. The little bells on its hem were ringing, and 3 mice were sitting in his dark hair. And that is the end of that chapter. So you guys will have to wait all the way until Monday to find out the end of this book. I am going to tell you I will read the whole end on Monday. It's 2 chapters, but I'll do both of those chapters on Monday. Okay, so this chapter has some incredible visualizations. What I mean by that is the way that the author has described the things that are happening for me as a reader really helps me picture in my mind. This chapter only had 1 illustration, so you guys are going to get to choose which part you want to illustrate. A couple parts come to mind for me if you need an idea. The very first one that came to mind for me is when they are fighting and the sorrowful knight has his sword kind of down on the chest of the spiky knight, and he's kind of declared that he's won. So that was a part that I thought of. This last part with Albert and the sparks of colored fire, and then Albert appearing out of nowhere, that would be another great one. Or if you want to just draw out the tilting ground with the kind of flamed torches and Osmond sitting up on his chair, that would also be another option. So just like you guys did before, do an illustration with me. Parents can either email it to me or text it to me. Nice job, you guys.